It's all yours, Kim.
Wow, thank you so much, Gary and Cheryl. I'm really excited to be back with this group, which is probably a different group than the group I spoke to, in the before times and before COVID. And so it's really great to be back. It's wonderful to hear. I knew about ANV, but it's just lovely to hear the background again because that's how I think about Arlington. I think about Arlington as a small town, as a place of real community, and that's what my topic is on too, about how people sort of find each other and create community even sort of outside of a fixed space or a fixed building. They find ways to connect with each other. So it's just, I think, a really perfect topic for this particular group. So I'll be sharing a PowerPoint. I'm grateful to Gary for monitoring questions because when I have a PowerPoint in front of me, it's hard for me to see people raising their hands. So thank you for managing any questions. And I'm happy to take questions and comments during my presentation, like throughout it, so that it feels like a conversation versus me just talking at you for however long. But then I will at some point get to the end of that, turn the screen sharing off, and then we can just have an open conversation before the end as well. But before I start sharing my screen, as someone we started to talk about, I always, before I talk about Little Saigon, love to just at least get a show of hands or some people sharing just one or two comments about what they remember about Little Saigon. Because if any of you have been here since for a couple decades or more, chances are you remember some aspect of when Clarendon was more of a Vietnamese community. Do I have one or two people who might want to share a little bit of their memories before we start? How about Liz? I see Liz.
You're muted,
You're
Liz.
muted.
I thought the press space bar thing still worked, but I guess it does. Well, this was when it was still transitioning from just sketchy neighborhood to Vietnamese. And I
Mhm.
remember my friends saying, the restaurants there are great, but be careful. And
Mhm.
there was a shoe store there that was, everybody was like, oh, I will go to the shoe store, but it's terrifying that. So the neighborhood has changed immensely.
It has. I saw that Nancy and Pax also mentioned the restaurants. And what's interesting is
Yep.
I'll go through my presentation, but the restaurants were sort of like a second wave of Little Saigon. People think when they think of Little Saigon and Clarendon, they remember the restaurants, but that was sort of the second phase of it, which I'll go into. That's when the community was starting to look outward. So I'm going to start here in just a second, but I want you to think about like when an ethnic community develops, when it begins, it's looking inward. They're looking at how to help themselves. And then once they get more established, they start to look outward to the outer, larger community. That's where assimilation into the larger community starts to happen. So while there were certainly little cafes and places to eat, the restaurant phase of Little Saigon was when the community was actually sort of starting to get comfortable. So I'm going to go ahead and attempt to share my screen here. And again, we can go through questions as we go. Let's see.
Okay, looks good.
I'm going to start the actual slideshow though from the beginning. So you all can still see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I have to start any talk by telling why this particular story has taken hold with me and why it's so important to me. And that is because I am actually the daughter of a Vietnamese immigrant. This story is very personal to me. I look very much like my Irish potato of a father. I don't really look Asian, but I am half Asian. My mother is a Vietnamese immigrant, and he was an American soldier, and he was over in Okinawa, Japan, serving, the U.S. Army in support of the growing war in Vietnam in the early half of the 1960s. So this is a picture of my mom and dad. They got married at Okinawa in 1966. That's my dad as a young soldier. And I just love this part of this letter that my dad had written home while he was over there, which says, don't worry, I don't think you have much to worry about. And if you did, it wouldn't help. So relax, keep the mail coming and the home fires burning. So this is when after my parents were married, actually a photographer got a picture of my mom and dad. They were in upstate New York right after my mother became a US citizen. They had been married for a couple years at this point. And actually, I was already born. I was a baby at home with a neighbor when my father took my mother down to the courthouse to become a US citizen. And a reporter got this. It's a real treasure for me to have. My father is gone now. My mother is still living, but my father is gone. And so I absolutely love this picture of my mother, a newly minted US citizen and, a former, a Vietnamese immigrant. She was not a refugee, and we'll talk about refugees versus immigrants as I go through the story. But in many ways, she came to this country kind of from a war-torn period. So a lot of what she experienced and told me resonated with what the Vietnamese refugee experience was at the time. And of course, this is a picture of me, very young. I think I'm 3 years old in this picture with my mother in the traditional Vietnamese dress. This is in Greenbelt, Maryland. So I grew up in Maryland. I did not grow up in Arlington. I moved to Arlington in 1996. However, the reason why I first knew about Little Saigon and Clarendon is because once it developed in the mid 70s, and my mother got wind of it because the word of mouth was immense in the Vietnamese community that was pretty far flung at that point, that there was a Vietnamese community growing in Clarendon. So my mother would drive us, all the way over to Clarendon from suburban Maryland, which felt like, eons. It felt like it took us forever to get there to myself, who was very young. And I have distinct memories of Little Saigon in the late 70s, even though I was a pretty young girl. So that's just a little bit about me and my history with this topic and why it's so important to me to keep this history alive. Okay, so I'm sure you all know a little bit about Arlington. It's began as a very rural community. It's obviously a close-in suburb of DC, but its proximity to DC obviously has everything to do with the development of Little Saigon. So I just kind of wanted to throw these maps up here just for historical interest, so you could just be reminded that we can never really escape our proximity and our connection to the nation's capital. Here in Arlington, and it does play a very big role in the development of Little Saigon and Clarendon. So these are some interesting historical pictures. So Arlington was largely a rural community, through about 1920. It was known as Alexandria County until 1920. But then obviously as the nation's capital began to grow and as Arlington became a more thriving suburb of the nation's capital, it became a busier, close-in community with lots of shops and restaurants, and Arlington became a pretty booming suburb of Washington, D.C. by the mid-century. The development of the Pentagon, which was completed in 1943, had a major impact also on Arlington, really transitioning from a more rural kind of county in the early part of the 20th century to a very robust suburban county. And now to this day, I would call us a very urban county. I'm sure you all experience that as residents here. The picture on the left, which I find very charming, it's not super clear, but this is downtown Clarendon in the 1950s. And it was the Clarendon neighborhood of Arlington by mid-century was the downtown. It was the place to be. There was a movie theater there. There were department stores. If you can look carefully on the right side, you'll see that J.C. Penney's department store was in Clarendon. There was a Sears. If you look at this building on the left, if you can see the picture on the left, you see the curved top building there. That's called the Reese Building. And that pops up a couple times in my presentation. You might recognize that as the CVS building. And that is still there. It was built in 1929. It's kind of a touchstone. So I want you to kind of keep your eye out for this building, because this building, it's one of those if these walls could talk kind of buildings. It's seen so much change over the 20th century and now the 21st century. As many of you probably know, Wilson Boulevard used to be a two-way boulevard. So there was very close in development on both sides. Then at some point with the advent of the metro, they split it into the two boulevards, Clarendon Boulevard and Wilson Boulevard, and kind of changed the way that downtown appeared. But this was obviously Wilson Boulevard in the 1950s. So fast forward, to the 1970s, and we have massive construction. So this is when the metro was starting to come in. So if you all know that, can anyone answer or guess what the big development was? I'm sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. What changed in the 1960s? Can someone give me an answer about what was a big change that affected shopping in the 1960s? Does anyone have a guess as to what that might have been?
Shopping malls.
Shopping malls, exactly. And even before that, the development of the interstate highway system. So in the 50s, you probably all remember stories from your parents or your grandparents talking about the walkability of shopping. You went downtown, you got out of your car, you walked around. By the 1960s, that had all completely changed because of the development of the interstate highway system, the development of suburban shopping malls. People really loved the idea of hopping in their car and getting out of the city to go shopping and being in some big air-conditioned building where they could get all their stores at once. So that began to contribute to a real decline in downtown shopping. So that was happening in Arlington and all over the country in the 1960s. And at the same time, by the 1970s, so Clarendon was getting pretty dead at that point. And I know we were saying, Liz, you were saying that it was kind of sketchy at that point. The Arlington County was wringing its hands. County officials were wondering, what are we going to do? The shopping has gone away from Arlington. But one way to sort of help develop the communities around DC was to develop the subway system. So all these major things are happening, and these all play into Little Saigon. We have the interstate highway system, the development of suburban shopping malls, and now we have the development of the Washington Metro system. So I'm going to go back to my screen now. I'm sorry. I don't know if there's a really easy way to kind of go back and forth between showing my screen and not showing it. So let's go back to this picture now. So this is what you see, that building in the picture on the right. That's that same curved, it's called a swan's neck parapet is the architectural term for that kind of curved top at the top of that building that houses the CVS now. This is what downtown Clarendon looked like in 1975. It was a disaster. And you have already had shopkeepers and stores clearing out of there anyway, because no one wants to shop, on foot anymore. They all want to drive to the shopping mall anyway. So most of these buildings were already empty. And then when you tear up the roads to develop the Orange Line, the metro that was springing out like spokes of a wheel from downtown DC, many of these storefronts fell empty. So this was kind of the perfect storm that was happening in Clarendon. It was a dying community. It was not the robust shopping mecca that had been just 20 years earlier. So what is happening in Southeast Asia? Well, all this kind of commercial and economic changes are happening in the United States, during this time. What's happening in Southeast Asia is incredible unrest and war between North and South. So as probably everyone knows, obviously I can't go into the whole history of the Vietnam War, but you have, the Republic of North Vietnam and South Vietnam, this really long, drawn out contested war that we were heavily involved in on the side of the South Vietnamese in communist regime of North Vietnam. And it all comes crashing down on April 30th, 1975, which is the fall of Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City, of course. And so the end of the Vietnam War and the fall of Saigon sends thousands of refugees to all ports all over the world, but especially to the United States. South Vietnam had looked at us as allies. We were their allies. We were trying to help them. And there was a real strong sense of duty among our US military at the time to take care of, these sort of fallen comrades, these folks that we had been fighting against against North Vietnam. So there was quite an effort to accept refugees from Vietnam, at least in 1975 and the couple of years after. And just to set some context, before the fall of Saigon, there were only 15,000 Vietnamese people in the entire United States. Just 15,000. I mean, barely, making a dent on our US census. Within 5 years of the fall of Saigon, there were 235,000 Vietnamese. That is how many people came from Vietnam in just 5 years. It was an immense change for our country and for their country, and it was a major area of our time of upheaval. But even before the fall of Saigon, even though there were only 15,000 Vietnamese nationwide, 3,000 of them were in Washington, D.C. Why? Because this is the center of government. This is the center of the military. The Pentagon is here. So chances are, if there was a war going on, like people who were here had some connection to either our US military or US government. So we had 3,000 people, Vietnamese people here, and that was a major drawing force for refugees. So once Saigon fell, people tended to know somebody here, or they had a connection with somebody here. So obviously, Washington, D.C. became a place to settle. Okay. So just real quick here, because I want to get to the more specifics of Little Saigon, but, oh, sorry, that did not mean that to go forward. So Vietnamese refugees settled all over the country. As you can see, it just had to do with where there were sponsor organizations, which might be church organizations, Catholic charities, Lutheran charities, as well as military installations. There were 4 major refugee resettlement centers after the Vietnam War. Obviously, our closest one was in Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania, and then we had the nation's capital here. So if you look at this map, this is where people, Vietnamese people tended to settle around the country after the fall of Saigon, and it's still where major Vietnamese populations are. And you'll see there's a pretty sizable circle around Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia. I just included this picture on the top right is just one of many, many kind of booklets that our US government put together for refugees during that time period. I just love this image because I'm talking a lot about sort of, statistics and what happened, but I don't want to escape, the hardship of what it was to be a boat person, as they were often called, to leave your homeland, under duress, regardless of where you are or what conflict it is. It's still happening to this day. You might have heard that there's, a phrase that's growing called climate refugees. Refugees are all over the country all the time, or all over the world all the time. And it's no small thing to leave your place, your home, under duress, often with only the clothes on your back. So this is a charcoal drawing by a graphic designer named Min Ung. And I just think it's very moving and very beautiful because it conveys kind of the sadness of leaving home. Okay, so I mentioned that Washington, D.C. was already a major center of Vietnamese people and a natural attraction, being the center of government and the center of the U.S. military. So what I find particularly interesting is that the fall of Saigon happened on April 30th, 1975, but there were already 2 stores open in some of those empty storefronts in Clarendon before the fall of Saigon. And one was called Saigon Market, as you see on the left, and one was called Vietnam Center. And they were just both on that strip of Wilson Boulevard that's, right near that CVS on the north side of the Clarendon Metro Plaza, where there's still like a 7-Eleven there now, and the CVS and a couple of other little businesses. And the reason why that was the case is because both the owners of these markets had connections to the US military. So the US military was well aware, the US military pulled our troops out of the conflict a couple years earlier. They were well aware that things were going south and not going very well in South Vietnam. And so there were several Vietnamese people that were already, if they had connections, that were already leaving Vietnam before the fall of Saigon. I believe it was Saigon Market that was opened by the wife of a CIA officer. So again, a very connected person. But you have 3,000 Vietnamese already here in DC, and then you have a place with empty storefronts because it's been a dying shopping area that already has a couple of Vietnamese places open there when Saigon falls. So naturally, people go, oh, there's already Vietnamese resources there. There's already markets there. There's already people I can connect with and some sources of support. That becomes a magnet for refugees coming here after the fall of Saigon. So within 1 year, and definitely by 2 and 3 years after the fall of Saigon, so Vietnamese stores start to just flourish along this, like basically a 2 or 3 block stretch of Wilson Boulevard in Clarendon. It's just remarkable how fast this happens. And one of them, one of the most important stores to open is this store called Pacific that you can see in this picture. If you're standing at the Clarendon Metro station on that little plaza and looking north, I believe that's North Highland Street, there's a big office building. It's a pretty banal, generic office building on that north corner directly across from the Clarendon Metro Station, but that used to be the Pacific Oriental Supermarket. And this was one of the most important businesses in Little Saigon, right on that corner, because again, it's location, location, location. And if you recall what I said about an ethnic community needing to look inward, the earliest businesses that in Little Saigon were markets meant to market goods and services to this community specifically. The people who worked there spoke only Vietnamese. It was pretty much all Asian, kind of decorations and food and fabric and things like that. And Pacific was no exception to that. What I find particularly interesting is that some of these earlier businesses are trying to be many things to this community because the need is so great. If you're a refugee, you need everything. So if you look at Pacific, you'll see that they call it a department store, an international supermarket, and a restaurant. Mayan Fabrics, now that will come up again later. The family that opens Mayan Fabrics on the actual corner of Highland and Wilson, I think it's Highland and Clarendon now. They are the people that went on to open Nam Viet restaurant. So we're going to talk more about Nam Viet in a little bit. But again, if you can read the description in English underneath a sign that says Mayan, it says fabrics, billiards, pool, electronic games. They are trying to do something for everyone because the need is so great. So Mayan Fabrics did have a tiny cafe at the very back of the store. And then the restaurant, what Pacific calls a restaurant, was also what you might just consider a little cafe. It was not very, posh or kind of sophisticated anyway. It was just a place to gather. And that is a critical thing for, new arrivals too, for a place to talk and sit and speak your own language. All right, I'll stop here a second. I see that I have a question about where the refugees lived, and that's a very, very good question. Because I talk a lot about the commercial aspect of this community because the actual residents where the Vietnamese refugees lived were spread all over the DC area. There were rare places where there was actually like a strong congregation of Vietnamese residents. And that's because early arrivals had to just live with sponsors or kind of go where there was someone that could help them. So often it was pretty far flung. The center of this community was this commercial center. It wasn't necessarily a residential center. So there were folks that came here from Maryland, who lived in Maryland or DC or Arlington or Fairfax. The biggest community of Vietnamese residents during this time period was in the Buckingham Village garden apartments. But even that, it wasn't a major area of Vietnamese settlement. Now there are more concentrations of Vietnamese residents near around Seven Corners where the Eden Center is. And the sort of center of Vietnamese residents tends to be in Fairfax County. But at the time, they were really, really pretty far flung. So, okay, so let's keep going. I don't want to talk too much about this one slide. I'm going to see if this works. I have a short, just, I think 40-second clip here from a member of the community named Win Ngoc Bic. He is no longer living, but he talks a little bit about the importance of Little Saigon. So let me see if I can get this to play.
We were sort of lucky in the sense at that time they were talking about building the metro. And so they tear down a lot of things in the Clarendon area. And so the real estate became very, very cheap. Sears and many of the major American establishments all move out because they don't want to have to run a business while there's so much risk of climbing over construction and things like that. And because of that, some of these real estate became available for very cheap, but they give you very short, contract. Like for instance, 6 months or 1 quarter, and things like that. But because of that, the Vietnamese could afford this kind of rent.
Okay, so if you could hear that, he was talking about the very short rental contracts that the landlords gave these shopkeepers and shop business owners. And that's because I think there was a sense that this was a temporary community. There wasn't necessarily a sense that, they wanted to have these small mom and pop Asian businesses to be in these businesses for very long. If you recall, the metro construction is still happening while Little Saigon is really becoming developed between 1975 and 1980. And so most of these stores were open in buildings that were, rented. And that's all that the refugees or these new business owners could really afford. But there was, it was sort of built-in obsolescence, which has to do with why Little Saigon went away later. We'll talk more about that.
We were
Sorry. Here's just a couple other stores. If you can see, like this is, these are buildings that still exist to this day. This in the top picture, this is an old Oddfellows Hall. If anyone knows about the Oddfellows, it's sort of it was a well-known sort of fraternal society that was very popular in the 20th century, but it had fallen empty by the 1970s. And you'll see that there are several Vietnamese businesses here. There's a couple jewelry stores, and actually jewelry is a big business for Little Saigon. And one of the reasons for that, you might wonder, why do refugees need jewelry? But it's kind of a currency that you can hold on to. It's a currency you can count on. And again, like if you're a refugee and you're not sure of where your money is going to be held, or that kind of thing, sort of having gold or something that feels more solid was very important. So it's kind of an interesting aspect of Little Saigon that there were quite a few jewelry stores there. Here's one more short clip from another former resident or former business owner in Little Saigon.
So at that time, Arlington was a slow-growing, housing was reasonable, a lot of low-income rental housing, and it's very close to Washington, where they could go to the embassy or contact the Red Cross and different location where they could get news of their family, a State Department or the Defense Department. So I think Arlington for them was the most convenient. And people in Arlington at that time, I think, was quite welcoming, very welcoming to the people. Many churches opened up to receive refugees.
Okay, and so I just like these pictures. I'm just throwing these in here so you can see like some of the people of Little Saigon. These are the just images of, these are Hmong people who are kind of a Vietnamese culture that live in the mountains of Vietnam, and they're in some traditional dress there, and just some Vietnamese children, and just some of the street traffic. And what I find very interesting, if you look on the picture on the right, a lot of the signs were in both Vietnamese and in English, and this is, I think, an acknowledgement that the community is starting to maybe assimilate, to acknowledge that it's part of a larger community in America, and it's starting to look outward. So we start to move away from kind of the more inward focused businesses like the supermarkets that do everything, or the alteration stores, and more the development of restaurants which cater to the much larger community and make are much better known. Here are just a couple interesting, what I call interesting Washington Post and local newspaper coverage, because obviously the development of Little Saigon started to attract a lot of attention. What I find interesting about the Washington Post headline on the left side is that there was no one name for this community. It was not even considered historic or anything important at the time. It was just kind of this almost like Brigadoon, this like the community that sprung up out of nowhere. And so nobody really knew what to call it. Some of the Vietnamese business owners and patrons called it Wilson Boulevard. Let's go to Wilson Boulevard. Some people did call it Little Saigon. Some people called it the Saigon Strip. And then you see here the Washington Post headline writer calls it Arlington's Mekong Delta. And then on the right side, I want to point out this call out from this one article that I find very interesting, because if you think about it, Arlington is, a suburb of Washington, D.C. It's not, aside from Arlington Cemetery in the 1970s, it's not a place that necessarily would be a household word anywhere else in the world. But the presence of Little Saigon definitely made it known to refugee camps throughout Southeast Asia. So refugee camps were places in other parts of Southeast Asia where people who had left Vietnam were staying until they could find passage to someplace else. And so it says Arlington is said to be a household word in the crowded refugee camps filled with the peoples of Southeast Asia. And that is kind of amazing to think about, that our little county was so well known for having developed this area that was welcoming to the Vietnamese. But as you just heard Kim Cook say, Arlington was generally pretty welcoming to the Vietnamese arrivals because, this community was revitalizing an area that many considered pretty dead. All of a sudden, you had foot traffic again. You had shops, you had taxpayers, you had people coming into those wonderful restaurants, Queen Bee and Cafe de Lot and Little Viet Garden. And so it was generally considered a positive thing for the county. But whenever you have a lot of change at once, it can be challenging for people. So I felt it was important to share some of the things that people were saying that weren't as positive, or that shared more concerns, or that, maybe also might have been evidence of some racism. We had an Arlington County Board chair who said, "I am not prepared to ask the taxpayers of Arlington to shoulder the burden of all these extra Vietnamese students." Now, this county board chairman may have said that, but Arlington Public Schools generally was incredibly welcoming to Vietnamese students. In fact, the English as a second language program, it wasn't founded here. It had been founded someplace else, but ESL or ESOL or whatever, I'm not sure exactly what it's called now because it's changed names. It began in Arlington specifically to address the needs of Vietnamese refugees. It did not exist in any formal way until Little Saigon had happened. Here we had someone from the League of Women Voters, considered generally a very progressive organization in Arlington, but someone had said it used to be that when refugees came to this country, they got their educations on their own. People were not wet nursed. And then this was a white business owner in Clarendon who was very friendly to the Vietnamese. But he said, "Some of my customers say things about the Vietnamese similar to what I heard them say 20 years ago about the Jews, things like they don't belong in Arlington." So I just offer that to show that, it wasn't necessarily like all happy roses. It was a mixed bag, both for the Vietnamese and for the people around them in terms of all this change that was happening at that time. But having just talked about Arlington generally being a very welcoming place for the Vietnamese refugees in Little Saigon, this is a beautiful picture of a very traditional silk ribbon dance that is done by school children. You see, these are young girls doing this dance. I think this is at a high school in Arlington. I lost track of where exactly, but they were performing a traditional dance in one of the schools. And so that was, just evidence of, people showing interest in their culture and their, inviting them to share it. Something else that developed, after the advent of Little Saigon was the Mid-Autumn Festival. This is a traditional children's festival that takes place every September or October in Vietnam as a celebration of the harvest. And some of the Vietnamese immigrants who had come here after the fall of Saigon started a Mid-Autumn Festival in the Arlington public school system that was very, very popular. It now still happens. It's sort of separate from APS now, but it used to be something that happened, that Arlington school kids and other kids could come see. And so there was, lots of this cultural exchange happening that I found very positive. Oh, sorry, let me back up. I'm going too fast. But what happened? So I always say that, there was a fall of Saigon and there was a fall of Little Saigon. And obviously what happened is that the metro system was finished by the Clarendon Metro Station opened, I believe, in 1979. And so once that opened, the county said, well, we have the streets are no longer torn up. We're bringing, workers in here from, the far-flung suburbs and from DC. And they started to look at Clarendon as a place for revitalization. And so the Vietnamese business owners and shop owners in Clarendon saw the writing on the wall and said, the rents were starting to be increased now that the metro was open and you had some of those short-term leases to begin with. And so a group of investors, Vietnamese investors who had done very well for themselves in the previous few years in Little Saigon, decided to open or to invest in this abandoned shopping mall in Seven Corners. It was an old shopping mall, had kind of fallen into disrepair, just probably for very similar reasons as why Clarendon had fallen into disrepair. And they opened the Eden Center. And we can talk about it. I'm sure people have gone to the Eden Center. The Eden Center is just a very well-known landmark in Falls Church. It opened in 1984. And, it's had its ups and downs, but generally has been going strong, for 40 years. It's a remarkable center for the Vietnamese community, and now really more even kind of a Pan-Asian global community. And I think some of the symbolism at the Eden Center is very interesting because the Eden Center is named after a very famous shopping district in the former Saigon called Eden Arcade. And there's also a very old marketplace in the former Saigon called the Ben Ton Market that has a clock tower, much like what we see here at Eden Center. So the architecture and the name were very intentional. And obviously, as we often see in places of Vietnamese community, they fly both the former South Vietnamese flag and the American flag there. And then, of course, as we talked about, here's Clarendon today. It's unrecognizable from its Little Saigon past. It's a thriving place. It's full of young people. People move in, they move out. There's that old Reese building again, the building that's seen it all over the last 100 years. And now, of course, it's been a very successful CVS for a long time. But I wanted to come back to Nam Viet. And I know there's questions in the chat, which I'll get to in a second, but Nam Viet is the only business that remains from the Little Saigon era. The owners were originally opened Mayan Fabrics, like I said, and they did so well for themselves that they were able to then go around the corner on North Hudson Street and open Nam Viet. And they have kept Nam Viet going all these years quite successfully, in part because at some point they were able to buy their building. They own their building. So unlike some of these other businesses that had to deal with these, crazy rental contracts and short leases and rising rents that forced them out, essentially, Nam Viet was able to own their building, keep their business. They're sitting on a really nice property there in Clarendon, and they are still really going strong. And what I love is that, Richard Wynn, who is the son of the original owner, is now the general manager. And he says that to them, Little Saigon was like their Mayflower or their Plymouth Rock. I'll quickly just mention that there have been ongoing cultural preservation efforts for Little Saigon. We have, the Virginia Tech students collected a lot of oral history interviews. I regularly do walking tours showing some of these former places. I'm the author of a 28-page booklet about Little Saigon there are still hard copies available and PDFs, which I can share with you all. There was a big community event commemorating the fall of Saigon and the beginning of Little Saigon in Clarendon in 2015 for the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. And there are similar and even bigger events planned for next year, which is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. But the way I think about it is I think, obviously the fall of Saigon is a very serious and incredibly important historical event, but closer to home, I want us to think next year that it's the 50th anniversary of the beginning of Little Saigon and this incredible period of change and transformation that had, an impact on Arlington that we still feel today in terms of being a very culturally diverse and welcoming community. So
we have a suggestion that, oh, well, never mind.
I was just going to say, sorry, go ahead.
No, there was a gray bar visible on the bottom of your screen when you were sharing. And the suggestion was if you just click on the screen, that would go away, but
oh, sorry. Yeah, I can click it back on, or I can share that quote with you. So I think I'm going to end it there. I know I talked a lot, and I kind of ran through it quickly, but let's see what other questions have I missed here? Do I speak Vietnamese? No, not really. Unfortunately, I don't. And the reason being is that, I think we viewed immigrants differently in the 1970s. If you remember the Schoolhouse Rock thing that said the Great American Melting Pot. There was more of a sense that to become American meant to blend in. And so that was true for many immigrants, and my mother was no exception. So she, like many former South Vietnamese, felt very connected to the United States. She's very patriotic. She's so grateful for the effort that the US military put in South Vietnam. And she wanted to show her gratitude by being the best, most patriotic American that she could be. And so part of that for her was to raise American children who spoke English. And so I had no idea what I was missing by having a mother who insisted on only speaking English with her children, me and my brother. And I tried in vain to learn Vietnamese as an adult, but it's a hard language, and learning anything as an adult, I think, is challenging, and my brain just couldn't get it. But that, you know, I tried. I know a few words, and my accent is horrible, but thank you for asking. Okay, let's see. Do I have any history of the establishment that was there on the corner of Wilson Boulevard and Rhodes Street? That I'm not sure. I don't know if I know exactly that intersection you're talking about. Was that the Little Viet Garden? I don't know if Grace is, yeah, I'm not positive I know that intersection very well. Okay, Zare's department. Okay, Zare's. Oh, I see. Okay, so Altman's and Zare's were in the neighborhood. Was there much of an interplay between Jewish and Vietnamese in the neighborhood? Well, as I mentioned, I quoted that one quote from that business owner who said that he felt there was an interesting connection between the way people were viewing the Vietnamese as the way people talked about the Jews, like 20 years earlier. And I don't have tons of evidence of major interplay, except that there is a tendency sometimes with other people to find each other. And I think there were plenty of non-Vietnamese businesses that were still trying to stay alive in and around Clarendon during the 1970s. And my general sense is that there were Jewish business owners there and other immigrants there trying to do business as well, and that they generally all got along pretty well because, frankly, they were in the same boat, So that's my general sense, but that's kind of a gross generalization. I don't have deep understanding of connections there, and that's definitely a research question worth following up on. Do I have relatives who remain in Vietnam? And so I've ever visited them. Also, what's my favorite Vietnamese restaurant? So I was going to go to Vietnam for the very first time with the Arlington Chamber of Commerce in 2020. And what happened in 2020? So like in 2020, that trip got canceled. The Chamber of Commerce took their trip to Vietnam a little while ago, but unfortunately I was unable to join, and I was really sad about that. So I have yet to be there myself. It's a bucket list thing for me. I do have relatives there, not close relatives, but cousins basically, and people I could probably find there, but I would like to go someday. And oh gosh, so sadly a lot of my favorite Vietnamese restaurants have gone away, but I actually love Nam Viet. So I really believe that Nam Viet is worth going to because of its historical importance to Arlington, but also because the food is darn good. My favorite, I have 3 favorite Vietnamese places in Eden Center. One is Rice Paper. Rice Paper is kind of a posher restaurant. It's kind of a place I bring people from out of town. But in terms of like more down home Vietnamese food, I like Hung Viet in Eden Center or Viet Foods. So there's a couple, but I love a lot of places in Eden Center. So, and it's funny, if any of you have gone to the newly revamped water park area of Crystal City, that's near where I live. I'm in South Arlington. The water park area along Crystal Drive has just been redeveloped with a lot of little kind of food trucky type business. They're like permanent kiosks, but they're like kind of street food kind of places. There's a Vietnamese food there, or Vietnamese place there that's just called Pho Wheels. It's a play on the word pho Wheels, because it began as a food truck. Their Vietnamese food is excellent. I was like, wow, for this little kind of kiosk place, I love it. So anyway, yes, okay. In the Nam Viet restaurant, there's a wall display of photos of Army generals. Any idea of the significance of these photos? I know one of the generals. So Nam Viet, again, there is such a strong tie for so many Vietnamese, former South Vietnamese of a certain generation with the military, with the U.S. military and with the former South Vietnamese military. The original owners of Nam Viet, it was incredibly important to them to pay homage and tribute and support our US military. So from the beginning, they became a place for reunions of former Vietnam veterans, South Vietnamese, military and US military. John McCain went there many, many times. And so they have become still to this day, there are military reunions and meetings that take place in Nam Viet. They're a business that holds so much patriotic pride. And so it's a really wonderful place to go and just look around at the pictures on the walls because they tell incredible stories as well. Okay, let's see. My friend Han told me of a harrowing story of leaving South Vietnam through Cambodia to France and the US. And did my mother become active with refugees? No, yeah, many, many harrowing stories. One thing I was kind of racing through my presentation, there are so many more stories I could have shared, but one of them is that nobody really knows how many boat people, as they were called, which was sort of like the second wave of refugees, in the 1977, 78. Nobody knows how many actually perished at sea. The thought is it could be, relatively low percentage, like maybe 10%, but up to half. Some historians think that up to half the people that had to leave Southeast Asia and Vietnam as boat people perished at sea. So when I hear of someone having a harrowing story, there are so many harrowing stories. And so it's, you may not think that a little grocery store in Arlington is that important in the grand scheme of things, but if it's a place where you feel safe and that you have landed on your own 2 feet and you can buy food that looks and smells and tastes familiar, like that is the most important thing, I think. So that's why I think this is so important, because that period was harrowing for so many. And my mother did not become active in any formal way with refugees. I mean, she was a typical American mom in a way. Like in the 70s, she was raising me and my brother and being a wife. My parents did split up, but but she's a pretty shy and private person, so she wasn't necessarily very active in any formal way. She certainly had many friends who had come to the United States as refugees. Was there competition between early arrivers and later ones? That's a really complicated question. I don't know about competition. There probably was. There was class differences. I wish there was a politer way to say it. The earliest people who could get out of Vietnam tended to be the ones who had connections. They were the ones who had a friend who had a friend who had a spot on an airplane or a helicopter or a boat, or they're the ones like the two businesses that were opened here in Clarendon before the war even ended, because they had connections. They were more formally educated. They had more resources at their disposal. And so, I'm not sure about competition, but I certainly know that life was harder for the second and subsequent waves of refugees that were forced to leave, because they just often, had almost nothing and really had to start, from scratch when they got to wherever they were going. Then Nancy says, anyone who has visited Vietnam in recent years seems to say how welcoming and nice everyone is. I've heard that too, and that's why I'd really like to go. I mean, Vietnam's changed a lot. The politics have changed a lot, and it's interesting how time does heal things. And so I'm really happy to hear that, and I'd really like to go myself sometime. One interesting thing, my mother's in her 80s now, but I always wanted to go back to Vietnam with her, and she never wanted to go. She said, no, I will never, ever go back there, because for her, it will never be a place, but it will never not be sad for her. It just can't be anything but sad, because it's her homeland that was disappeared. It was gone. So I just resolved at some point that I would go without her. And at this point, I might just wait till she's gone, because it just might be hard for her to know that I'm going without her. So, but yeah, anyway. Yeah, so there's lots of great questions and comments in here. To what other countries did the Vietnamese travel besides the US? I know there was a lot who went to Europe. I know there were some Vietnamese that even went to South America. I mean, it was like different. I think it depended on where there were resources and where you had connections. But there's a big French influence, obviously, if you know Vietnamese history in Vietnam, there's a lot of French occupation. You had Japan one, absolutely. And so I know that there were a lot of Vietnamese that ended up in Europe and in France. Our mailman is originally from Vietnam and he says the same thing, no interest in visiting. It's so difficult. My mother also has deep distrust. You know, so when her mother was alive, when my grandmother was alive, she's long since passed on. I remember that my mother would send things back to her in Vietnam because her mother didn't leave and stayed there, and she would hide um, money and hide little things that like my grandmother might need in other things that they wouldn't get searched and confiscated, you know, when they got there. I remember stories of her like rolling up American dollars and stuffing them inside Folgers coffee. And one time she even like squeezed all the toothpaste out of a tube and like stuck some jewels in the toothpaste and then sealed it back up. I mean, crazy stuff, but that's how scary it was in the years right after the end of the Vietnam War. So, well, I feel like I've talked a lot at you. Any other questions? I'm sorry if I raced through that. You know, sometime you'll have to come on my walking tour and we'll have more time. So,
Do you have any updates on what's going on with the Eden Center?
yes, I'm so glad you bring that up. So, as you might have all seen, the City of Falls Church is undergoing a real like sort of revitalization, kind of revamping effort for that part of Falls Church that includes Eden Center. And there were major concerns about displacement and what it would do to Eden Center. And it was very heartening for me to see how valued Eden Center has become as a landmark. The city had always said that they would do their best to protect Eden Center as a Vietnamese place and as an Asian place. But what I have really been heartened by is that there's an organization that's sprung up called Viet Place Collective, VPC. They're run by all young people, and I hope that's not patronizing for me to say, all much younger than me with a lot of energy, who really became active in representing the Vietnamese community and making sure that Eden Center, no matter what Falls Church does, remains a Vietnamese place. And in fact, they've been pushing to have the city lean in even more and do more acknowledgement of Eden Center as an important historical place, not just for the Vietnamese, but for everyone. And one thing I forgot to mention in my presentation is that if you've gone to Eden Center recently, in 2022, the state of Virginia installed a historical marker there. So as you look at the main gate, you know, the main red and yellow gate, it's just to the left, right on Wilson Boulevard. And it's a great historical marker. If you're over there shopping or eating, it's worth walking over there to read it, because what I love about the historical marker is that it doesn't just talk about Eden Center. It mentions that the origins of Eden Center began in Arlington. They began in Clarendon. So we kind of get that credit, which is great. But I think it's still unsettled. I feel pretty confident with the Viet Place Collective folks having made great strides in making contacts with the City of Falls Church. I feel pretty confident that Eden Center will remain. It might even get to some improvements because of all the attention that's coming to it. I don't think anyone would sit by and let this important place go away. So I'm not that worried about it. I think it's just going to continue thriving and hopefully get even better. How do we learn about your walking tours? So thank you. I do at least one walking tour every year in May with the Arlington Public Library. Sometimes we've done two, but every May I do a walking tour with Arlington Public Library. So you can always look there and see if they're coming up. I'll also post them on my website, which is kimaoconnell.com with no apostrophe. I can type that in there. O'Connell.com. That's me. But I also do walking tours for groups. So, you know, I know I've just told all this history to you, but if this group, for instance, ever wanted to do kind of like a walking tour of Clarendon and then maybe have a lunch at Nam Viet where we could do kind of a culinary tour of the Vietnamese menu, I'd love to do something like that. So I also just get booked for private tours from various groups. So just something to keep in mind, or if you're belonging to any other organization that might benefit or might enjoy a walking tour, just reach out to me and let me know. I've given tours for Arlington Public Schools and the state of Virginia and government officials and all kinds of things. So have I interviewed military personnel who served in Vietnam and returned? I haven't done a lot sort of like military interviewing. My interest has been more on kind of what happened next. There's so many military historians who are better than me at sort of military history. And obviously, a few years back, Ken Burns did an amazing documentary about the Vietnam War, and an amazing, book about it that covers some of that. So I highly recommend that. Any other thoughts or questions? Oh, Nancy? Oh, no. Okay, she's just waving.
So coming back on, it's 11 o'clock now. And Kim, thank you so much. I must tell you that your presentation was a bit of a personal experience. I was an Army nurse during the Vietnam War, except I was in Japan.
Oh, wow.
And during between 1969 and 1971. So I saw
thank
many of
you.
the troops that came back or went through Japan on their way back home. And so, of course, I've been living in Arlington now many years, but any kind of topic that pertains to the Vietnam War always has special meaning for me.
I appreciate knowing that about your history. Were you at Okinawa or someplace else?
No, I was at Camp Zama.
Okay, yeah. My dad, he spent most of his tour in Okinawa, Japan, and that's so the reason I probably skipped right over that too. I was very concerned about talking too much, and I probably still talk too much. But the reason my parents met is because my mother had specialized in languages at the University of Saigon, and she had a facility of language. It's gone away now. She's really getting up in years. She can still speak French, English, and Vietnamese fluently. But during that time, she was also fluent in Chinese, knew some Japanese, could speak a little German even. So she had an incredible facility for language that the U.S. Army really noticed. They hired her to teach in their Vietnamese school, to teach Vietnamese to American soldiers that were going over, to Vietnam. And my dad was in her class. So, and according to my dad, like all the soldiers in the class who were single wanted to take her out, and she did go out with a few of them. But my dad somehow caught her eye, and they ended up marrying on Okinawa. So
great story.
Yeah, well, I would love to hear more of your story. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, it was an interesting time because, of course, it was not only the Army base, Camp Zama, but there was also a naval base, Atsugi, and Air Force Tachikawa, and several naval bases is there. And so, yeah, I was there about 15 months, and then I finished my tour of duty at Walter Reed, the old Walter Reed on Georgia Avenue, in Washington, D.C. But yes, it was quite a time, especially my experience of working on an orthopedic ward and seeing so many troops coming back and going through with, war-related injuries. So it was quite a time.
It's going to be interesting because, next year, like I mentioned a few times, is a big anniversary. It's the 2025 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. It's going to bring up a lot of memories for a lot of veterans and a lot of people. But there will be a lot of, events and stories. I know in Arlington, we're planning a few things. I say I mean, the county government and others who are interested in these stories are planning a few events. And the state of Virginia is also planning some events to mark the occasion because it just affected so many Virginians, in so many ways, like not just the soldiers, obviously the soldiers, but the nurses and just, everyday people. So, I mean, I think next year will be a big year to kind of look backwards and kind of see how far we've all come from there.
Yeah. And in fact, the other thing that's quite interesting is I was the one who asked about the pictures of the generals, because one of them, another thing that I did, probably about 10 years ago now, I ran the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans.
Oh, okay.
So, of course, many veterans who came back from, who were Vietnam veterans ended up being homeless. And I cannot think of the guy's name, but as I said, every time my husband and I dine at Nam Viet, I see that picture of him, and he was on the board at the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. So I'm not sure what happened to him. I'm sure he's still around, but that brings back another yet facet of this Vietnam War and the fallout. So, but
to hear you talk, so I know we have to go, but I have to say I'm a journalist, I'm a writer. Like I am I'm more comfortable getting people's stories than talking at people. Like I feel frustrated when that I heard my own voice more than anybody else's, because my instinct is to want to hear all of your stories. So if any of you, Cheryl, Gary, any of you, Nancy, and everyone, just look me up on my website. I would love to hear more about all of you and your interest in Arlington and the things you do in Arlington and who you are as Arlingtonians, because like that's just kind of more of what I do. I like to collect stories, you know, and learn about people. So please, I hope you'll all stay in touch with me.
Well, and very quickly, I will send you a note because I produce a podcast called Aging Matters, which I've been doing for 7.5 years now. So be happy to send you that information. So
I love it.
So, but I'm going to close out here again. We certainly want to thank Kim for her information, and it was an excellent presentation, brought back lots of memories for me, and I'm sure other people here as well. And so just a reminder, next week is a very poignant topic for everybody, older adults particularly. It's called Loneliness in Seniors, and our guest will be Maureen Harris, who's a technology and learning specialist at the Digital Health and Happiness Lab at Georgetown University in DC. So be sure and stop in, if you will, and tune in. And we'll see you again next week at 10 o'clock, same time, same station. So have a good week. And thanks again, Kim.